This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, welcome. This is the Clatsop County Comprehensive Plan Update Countywide Citizen Advisory Committee. Today's meeting, while we're showing an agenda for January 21st, today is February 18, 2021. It is 11 a.m. I'll call this meeting to order. Today's meeting is a continuation meeting from that January 21st agenda. We still had some work to do, and we had scheduled an interim meeting but failed to have a quorum for that meeting. So we're continuing the work where we left off. Are there any changes from the group before we get started? Any changes to the agenda or anything that we need to cover? I'll just ask quickly. Okay, hearing none. Then let's do quick introductions. I'll go around the room as I see it. So, Chris Farrar, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Chris Farrar. I live in the Astoria area, spend most of my time on John Day River Road. I'm one of the commissioners on the County Planning Commission, but I just attend these meetings for my own benefit to see how the process is working.
Thanks, Chris. And I failed to introduce myself. My name is Andy Davis. I'm the chair for the Countywide Citizen Advisory Committee, and I live in Astoria. Jim Allegria, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Jim Allegria. I'm also on the Countywide Advisory Committee and representing from Astoria. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Todd Lundy?
Hi, yes, Todd Lundy. I'm the representative from the Southwest Citizens Advisory Committee, Southwest Coastal Citizens Advisory Committee.
Thanks, Todd. Carol Johansson? I'm not hearing Carol. She may be on mute. How about Dory Larson? Also can't hear Dory. Tita Montero, can you introduce yourself to the group?
Yes, my name's Tita Montero. I happen to be a member of the Seaside City Council, and I'm basically here as a member of the public.
Thanks for joining us, Tita. Jan Mitchell?
My name is Jan Mitchell. I live in Astoria and I'm on the Countywide group.
Thanks, Jan. Susanna Gladwin?
Hello, Susanna Gladwin from the Jewel Vine Maple Air Seaside Rural Group, the liaison. I live in Jewel.
Thanks, Susanna. How about Ashley Latora?
Good morning, I'm Ashley Latora. I work with the Oregon Department of Forestry as a stewardship forester.
Thanks, Ashley. Pat Corcoran?
Hello, Pat Corcoran. I live in Astoria, and I'm a member of the Countywide Citizens Advisory Committee.
Pat. Cheryl Johnson?
Cheryl Johnson out in Brownsmead. I'm a member of the Northeast CAC and then the liaison to the Countywide.
Thanks, Cheryl. Chad Washington?
I am Chad Washington. I work for Lewis and Clark Timberlands, managed by Greenwood Resources, and I am the Stewardship and Community Engagement Coordinator.
Thanks, Chad. Thanks for coming back today. And Gail Henriksen, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, Gail Henriksen, Community Development Director.
Thanks, Gail. Okay, so I think I've gotten everyone, unless Carol or Dory wanted to introduce yourselves. Give just a second for that. Okay, not hearing that. Then we'll go on to, did we have attached meeting summaries yet? Actually, I failed to review them myself. It looks like we have October 15 and November 19. Did anyone have changes or additions to those meeting summaries?
Yeah, and actually, Andy, those were reviewed at the January meeting.
Okay, okay, thank you. I'm inclined to unless there's objection from the group, I'm inclined to skip CAC liaison reports since we're significantly behind, even though they show on the schedule for today. Is there any objection to that from the CAC liaisons? Staff, is that all right with you, Gail?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so I think the item that we will start with today is on table 2 in your packet. That was, I think, page 20. That is for in the purple on table 2, countywide CAC identified issues for groundwater resources, new policies. There was a subgroup that was going to discuss some draft language for climate change policy. Did that subgroup, do you have anything to report at this time? Do we have draft language? That was Jim, Todd, and Cheryl, it says.
I think that bounced back to Gail to summarize. Am I right, Gail? When we were.
Yeah, so initially, Jim Allegria had submitted a document that included reference to the regional framework for climate adaptation, and the subcommittee was tasked with converting those over to policies that could be included in the comprehensive plan. And so we did meet, and then following that meeting, I tried to organize them as best I could, pulled out the ones that were relevant, tried to put them in a format that reflected the aspirational nature of the document that we're looking at. And that's the attachment that was included in the past couple of emails. And I can pull that up here for everyone to review. And I guess the question really before the group today is, what do you want to do with those policies? So, you know, we've cited where we think that they should be placed in the comprehensive plan. The first part is what the wording is actually from the regional framework for climate adaptation. The goals, then, where we think it would be appropriate for those policies to be placed, and then the suggested wording that we've come up with. And we've done that for each of the different areas that were included in that adaptation framework.
Gail, are you looking for thorough discussion of this item from the packet today? Are you looking for a motion to try and incorporate this all? What is your preference for how we handle it?
Yeah, so if everyone has read through it beforehand, and we did send it out, I think about a week ago, and if everybody's had time to read through it, then unless there are specific policies that the committee members want to pull to discuss, then I think we could just go ahead with a either up or down vote on what's remaining.
Okay.
I move that we adopt all of them and integrate them into the plan as Gail has suggested.
Okay, thank you, Todd. I've got a motion from Todd Lundy.
I second.
Second from
I
Jim
second
Allegria. Is there discussion of that motion to incorporate as presented by staff? Is there a discussion? Okay, hearing no discussion, I'll ask, is there objection from anyone in the group for incorporating this within the comprehensive plan document? Any objection from you all? Okay, so the motion passes by unanimous consent. And I believe we can move on to the next item, Gail. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we had that takes care of what was left on table 2, groundwater resources. So then we would be moving on to table 3, which is the.
And we're up to policy 10 now, is that correct?
Yeah, wildlife habitat resources and policy 10.
Okay. So again, in your packet, the PDF packet anyway, we're on page 27 now, policy 10. So this is wildlife habitat resources existing policies. Policy 10, the county will establish a procedure for protecting sensitive nesting sites from incompatible uses and activities. That's the existing policy language. Staff comment and recommended changes. It says that current practice is to send public notice to ODF and ODFW, and when staff has reason to believe sensitive, threatened, or endangered species might be present, or when code directs, USFW. So staff has requested updated habitat and nesting maps, but that's not necessarily impacting the policy language. Is that correct? You're not asking for us to put that into the policy language?
Correct. That's just an update on how the policy is currently implemented.
Okay, so staff recommendation is essentially to keep the language as is. Is that a correct reading of what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And then Southwest Coastal CAC. Todd, do you care to speak to the Southwest Coastal note there?
No, I think that the policy, I was trying to recall what we were up to, sensitive nesting sites. We wanted to make sure that that included the threatened and endangered species particularly, and it wasn't mentioned in that, and maybe it's mentioned in later ones, but that was the thrust of what we were up to there. I don't know how you incorporate it.
And it sounds like from staff note that that's de facto what's happening, right, Gail? That if there were threatened or endangered species, then you're acting in an elevated, appropriate way by contacting USFW.
Correct. And if the committee wants to spell that out, that it should include not only sensitive but threatened endangered species, then that's fine as well.
I think that would be good.
Todd, are you inclined to suggest language, or are you?
Well, let's just see. Let's see. We could just include protecting sensitive and endangered species, or no, the nesting sites of sensitive and endangered species from incompatible uses. So may I say it again?
Mm-hmm.
The county will establish a procedure for protecting nesting sites of sensitive and endangered species.
And do you want to include threatened?
Yeah, there we go.
Yes.
Sensitive and endangered. Yeah, threatened. Get all those levels in there.
So
sensitive, threatened, and endangered.
So Todd, I'm taking that
species
as a motion to insert the words threatened and endangered after sensitive in policy 10. So the county will establish a procedure for protecting sensitive, threatened, and endangered nesting sites from incompatible uses and activities. Is that correct as far as the motion?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Is there a second for that motion?
I second.
I second it.
Okay, thanks, Jan. Is there discussion of that motion, or are we happy with that? Okay, I'm not hearing discussion.
Yes.
So is there any objection to inserting the words threatened and endangered? Gail, thank you for the recording in the order that Todd gave it to you. Is there any objection to that amendment as recorded on the screen of sensitive, threatened, and endangered species?
Andy, could I just get a definition of what sensitive species is? Threatened and endangered are pretty clear.
Gail, do you have a definition you refer to on that?
No, we do not.
Doesn't the state have a list of sensitive species that's a category unto itself?
do not know the answer to that. I apologize. So just to be clear, this does not apply to lands that are covered, that have activities going on that are covered under Forest Practices Act. So just to be clear about that.
Thanks, Gail. Is there any objection from the group? I'll just check one more time. Any objection for the amended language? Okay, so I'm hearing no objection. So by unanimous consent, that amendment passes.
And just to answer the question, yes, the State Department of Fish and Wildlife does keep a list of sensitive species.
Thank you, Gail.
Yes.
Thanks for the clarification.
Ashley?
This is just a point for Gail in the next column over. USFW should be USFWS. It's United States Fisheries and Wildlife Service. It's the correct agency.
Thanks, Ashley. So is there, can I get a motion from the group to just quickly to pass policy 10 as amended? That's all we've done at this point, is just amend the policy. Susanna?
I move to accept the amended policy 10.
Okay.
Second.
Thanks, Todd. Is there any objection to accepting the amended policy 10? Okay, hearing no objection, that policy is accepted. Thank you all. So on to policy 11. Policy 11, the county will require that any additional rural residential development at River Ranch be clustered on the more northerly portion of the site. The county will implement other measures recommended to it by Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for minimizing the impact of additional rural residential development on Columbian white-tailed deer. Staff note is much of the southern portion of the River Ranch Peninsula is zoned open space, parks and recreation. Approximately 36 of about 112 acres of the southern portion remains in RA1 zoning, but is not developed. 3 of the CACs supported staff recommendation. Northeast recommended policy be moved to the Northeast Community Plan and removed from the countywide plan. And Southwest was asking about Northeast planning CAC's feedback, and indeed probably about moving it into Northeast. Is there discussion or a motion from the group about how to dispose of policy 11? Cheryl?
Yeah, Andy, I move that we move policy 11 to the Northeast CAC and leave it as written.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Thanks, Todd.
I'll second.
So the motion was to move policy 11 as written to the Northeast Community Plan. We have a second from Todd. Is there discussion of moving policy 11 into the Northeast Community Plan? Okay, no discussion there. Any objection to moving policy 11 into the Northeast Community Plan? Okay, I hear no objection. So by unanimous consent, policy 11 can be moved into the Northeast Community Plan and removed from the countywide plan. Policy 12, Clatsop County shall rely upon the Forest Practices Act and any supplemental agreements between Fish and Wildlife Commission and the Board of Forestry to protect critical wildlife habitat sites. The staff comment and recommended changes was that water and wildlife habitat protection are key elements of the FPA and the FWC's mission. Do I take that to be that staff recommendation as a whole is to keep the language.
Correct.
Thank you, Gail. We have 3 CACs that have supported staff recommendation. Northeast, sorry, I've got split across 2 pages, so I was having a little trouble reading it. Northeast is recommending a revision to the policy. I'll hold off on reading it. Cheryl, do you care to present what the sentiment of Northeast's amendments are here?
Sure. The concept that Forest Practices Act would be working cooperatively with Fish and Wildlife makes a lot of sense. That was perfect. We've had previous discussions about relying solely on Forest Practices Act. So this is sort of in line with previous discussions that we've had, especially for Goal 4. So our suggestion was that Clatsop County, rather than rely upon, instead that they would support and promote Forest Practices Act and supplemental agreements between Fish and Wildlife Commission to the Board of Forestry, adding language to the extent such measures are ecologically effective methods to protect critical wildlife habitat sites. And then wording that we've talked about before, the county shall seek changes to Forest Practices Act when necessary to better protect critical wildlife habitat sites. And possibly the wording on that, rather than the county shall seek, possibly the county shall support. So support would be a possibility in there. So that was our thinking there.
Cheryl, my preference anyway is if you want to present this amended language that we could try to pass it as one amendment if you choose to do that, or you could try the 3 individual changes.
I move that we revise policy 12 as proposed by Northeast CAC.
Okay. Is there a second?
I second.
Thanks, Susanna. Okay, so we've got
I second.
Thanks, Susanna. I got you. So we've got a motion and a second to adopt the language proposed by Northeast CAC and amend the original language of policy 12. Is there a discussion of these language amendments? So that's, again, that's the information that's contained in the Northeast CAC column, essentially amending or replacing the language that's in the existing policy 12. Is there a discussion of that? I see a hand from Jim. Jim?
Well, I believe from a policy perspective, it's best to parse this out and to have discussions on individual pieces. I think that makes for cleaner policy. For instance, we need to support and follow the FPA. So that is essentially the original language. And then we can discuss the county supporting any changes through the appropriate channels. I think these are separate issues.
I think that so we've got a motion on the table. I think we can have a supplemental motion to consider by paragraph. I'm not going to look that up and waste our time on that, but I think we can do that even now after we've got a motion to amend language. So Jim, if your preference is to consider them by paragraph here, which would mean just that we're considering each one separately, I think you can make that motion.
Right now, Andy?
Yes, sir.
Well, I move to parse the the Northeast to CAC into 3 different motions.
Okay, is there a second? Is there a second for that motion to consider each of the 3 of these separately? I think that was a second from Todd. I saw a wagging finger there. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, it is.
Okay. Is there any objection to considering the 3 of these as separate amendments? Susanna, is that objection?
Yes.
Okay.
I feel that the first,
Go ahead.
can I speak to it?
Yeah, we can have discussion.
I feel that the first part is a given of the Forest Practices Act and Fish and Wildlife. I feel that it's only the second half that is different, and I would just like to discuss it as a whole. That's all.
Thank you. Is there further discussion on considering these as 3 separate amendments? Okay, so since we've had objection, and I think I can see everyone who's a voting member of the group, I can see your faces. So I'm going to ask for thumbs up or down for this vote. All those in favor of considering the 3 of these as separate items, please signify by giving us a thumbs up. I have Todd, Jim, Jan, Pat, Cheryl, and then all those opposed to considering these as separate items, Susanna. So the motion passes by a vote of 5 to 1. We'll consider them separately. So let's consider the first amendment is to replace the language "shall rely upon the" with the language "support and promote the Forest Practices Act." Is there discussion of this item? Changing the language from "shall rely upon the" to "support and promote the." Discussion of that item. Pat?
I think that seems fine. I think what Susanna said was, I mean, on the Forest Practices Act lands, no policy can change those practices by, adding words onto it. I wondered, does there need to be a policy that says that the county shall support? I don't know that that's already stating the obvious, but in either case, it seems like that being a baseline, and what I'm sensing the sentiment is it would be as a minimum, or we had talked earlier about forested lands that are not subject to Forest Practices Act being encouraged or provided support and encouragement for doing things that might go above and beyond. My sense is that was the intent, was to have Forest Practices Act be a base and then have something else that would maybe be more than that. That's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Further discussion on this item?
And let me confirm that this is on our county and state Forest Practices Act designated lands. Is that correct? Or is this county land outside of that designation?
It would appear that the intent is to that the policy would apply to lands where Forest Practices Act would be applied.
I see. Yeah, then I think I would continue the thought of affirming the sort of obvious, but I think this sentiment from many in the group would be to have optional encouragement in addition to be language in the policy where feasible, encourage practices that exceed, I don't know what the proper language would be, but I guess that would be my distinction.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Susanna, did I see a hand from you?
Yes. Actually, I realized that I feel the language up there is stronger in saying support. The Forest Practices Act is legislation that is going to evolve, and there's a lot of pressure right now legislatively to continue to change it and evolve it. And I think that if the county is supportive of ways to effectively protect critical wildlife, that it's a stronger statement than the original statement.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion? Ashley? I can't hear you yet.
I just wanted to make the point that the Forest Practices Act applies to all commercial forest operations, regardless if you're inside or outside of an urban growth boundary, unless the municipality has a forest management plan that's been accepted by Oregon Department of Forestry, and the only one in our county is within the city limits of Cannon Beach right now.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks, Ashley. Okay, seeing no other hands up for discussion at the moment. See, is there objection to this amendment to replacing shall rely upon with support and promote? Any objection to that language change? Okay, so that language can be accepted, but Susanna, is that objection?
Yes. I want to
Okay.
retain support and promote.
So what we're voting on now, Susanna, to be clear, is whether we should change the language. The existing language is shall rely upon. The amended language that is suggested by this motion is to change shall rely upon to support and promote. Do you object to changing it to support and promote?
No, I'm sorry. Yes, I got a little lost in the weeds there. I'm fine.
Okay.
With support and protect.
So
Promote.
I don't believe I'm hearing any objection to the amendment then. So then by unanimous consent, that language change is accepted. So we'll move on to the second one. So the second language change that's suggested by Northeast CAC is to insert after Board of Forestry to the extent such measures are ecologically effective methods to protect critical wildlife habitat sites. Is there discussion of that inserted language? Any discussion of that? Gail and then Todd.
Okay, thank you. The concern that I would have about this proposed language is who is determining how that the measures are ecologically effective. It sort of makes an assumption that the Board of Forestry or the Fish and Wildlife Commission would adopt ecological measures that may not be effective. And as staff, we certainly don't have the expertise to be able to critique that, to make that judgment call. And we certainly don't have the funding at this time to hire a consultant to do an independent review of any methods that the Fish and Wildlife Commission or the Board of Forestry might adopt. So I have concerns about who's implementing that and how it's going to be implemented.
Okay, thank you, Gail. Todd, then Jan, and then Pat.
My question is for Cheryl. What was the intent of this change in language, Cheryl?
Well, we talked about the fact that the Forest Practices Act is always being updated and that new information is coming out all the time about best practices and what is and is not ecologically effective. I mean, what we're doing now in the forests, you know, would be considered, I mean, it's very different than it was 50 years ago or 25 years ago. So this is an attempt to not be locked in to language that may be outdated, and especially Forest Practices Act, you know, is legal and has to go through all of those channels to go through the legislature and all that jazz. So I think this is our attempt to say that, to keep up with science, with current science.
Thanks, Cheryl. Jan, and then Pat.
I didn't really have a comment.
Okay, thanks, Jan. Pat?
I definitely understand. I think the intent of where the Northeast was going with this. It is real fuzzy about, the sort of outcome-based measures and ecologically effective. I do jump ahead to the next one, which says the county shall seek changes to the act when necessary to better promote resources for wildlife. I can encompass kind of the intent in the next item that we discuss, and I think the next item is maybe a more effective way to get that out there.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Gail, I saw you had a hand up, and then I see Jim as well. I wondered if, Gail, you want to make your comment first.
Yeah, so if these ecological measures are part of the Forest Practices Act, even if they're not based on what any one of us could look at and say is the best available best practice at the time, it's still what's going to be required of the Forest Practices Act. So that's my comment. I'll stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail. Jim?
Well, what I would like to see is the third paragraph separate out into a new policy, and we can tweak that to partially to encompass the second paragraph, so that this particular policy would strictly be the first paragraph, and as an independent policy, we can look at the third paragraph and tweak it to include information from the second. Maybe I should phrase that as a motion.
So my feeling anyway is that wouldn't be an appropriate motion as we're considering an amendment to language here. Though in general, I guess if this failed, then when we get to new policies, which is just the next worksheet down, we could talk about including a policy if these don't get put in here. Does that make sense, Jim?
That's okay. That's fine.
Susanna, I saw you had a hand up.
I hate to go off on this, but after dealing with people who are dealing with sick raptors and how upset they get over rodenticides, and if there's a lawsuit in the future over these things that could affect Forest Practices Act, it's a complicated issue, the Forest Practices Act, and what is happening with it. I think people are not just accepting it sitting down like they used to. And I think it complicates the picture of the whole thing.
Thanks, Susanna. Gail?
Thank you. I know that we've discussed this issue before, but I just want to reiterate again and remind everyone that the Forest Practices Act, whether you like it or you don't like it, is what it is. And until it changes, this is what we work with. We don't have the ability to go above and beyond and start trying to rewrite the Forest Practices Act as part of the comprehensive plan update. And everybody really needs to remain focused on that. Thank you.
Pat, am I seeing a hand from you?
Remind us though where we are as far as procedure. I was going to go back to my point earlier. We're amending some language, then we're going to vote on, and it may or may not pass. Is that correct?
Correct. So we've got two pieces of language still to consider. Motions on the table to amend this sentence, which is the adding of the to the extent language, and then we've got another motion to consider, which is the adding the language at the end of after the sentence we're considering now. So we've got two motions on the table, and then and then we'll have a motion to just accept whatever amended language we have for the policy 12.
Thank you.
Jan, I saw a hand from you. Did you want to speak? And then I saw Todd just come off mute as well.
I'm not sure how to say this, but I think I'm listening to the conversation and hearing the pushback from staff and the pushback from state staff. Obviously, the people involved in this group have there's some activism in terms of change that we think needs to happen. And we're trying to put that into a document where, and put the county staff in a position where they take on some of that. And I'm not sure that that's possible. It's just, it is hard for us to accept the status quo and not put some language in expressing what we hope would happen in the future. And I appreciate Cheryl and her group having gone to work on that. That being said, I think we ought to at least put the language in aspirationally, because there is change happening in terms of the recognition of the impact of climate change, the impact of clear cutting on landslides, all of that kind of stuff. And it's, I don't want to put staff in the position that Gail's expressing, but somehow we have to find a way that we can attach ourselves to the new practices that may have to evolve. How's that? But that doesn't help us at all.
Jen,
Well said, Dan.
Suzanne, wait for your turn, please. I have Todd and then Gail.
Yes.
In an effort to move forward, I suggest that with Pat's idea, I suggest that if we agree that we should have this be a separate issue and deal with the language for it separately, then let's reject these two motions on the floor now and accept the first one that we did already accept and move on. And then when we get to the next new suggestions table, we will then readdress these issues. So my suggestion is, let's vote down these two amendments and then move on and get to this later.
Okay, thanks, Todd. Gail?
Yeah, so the comprehensive plan already has a policy that talks about the procedure that the county relies upon to make changes to the Forest Practices Act, and that goes through a specific committee that has been set up at the state level, I think through Board of Forestry, and they are an active committee that still continues to meet. So there is a process in place. There is already a policy in the comprehensive plan to identify that. Again, the concern that's been raised by, I believe, this group and other groups is they didn't like the process because they felt that they didn't like the people who had been appointed to the committee at the state level. But again, this is the framework in which we operate. And I just want to be very clear that we cannot change that framework through this comprehensive plan. And I still have concerns about this middle language about the ecologically effective methods and who is going to enforce that and how it's going to be determined.
Pat?
So I'm going to circle back to what we currently have is stating affirmation of the Forest Practices Act. That exists already, and that's just there. That is what it is. The sentence that says the county shall seek changes to the act when necessary to better protect, I think, is an aspirational component of that. I guess a question to Gail is, in the comp plan, is there language that says the county can bring up issues and try to advocate those through our liaison, I guess, to the Forest Practices Act, or is that already established? I guess if there is no assertion that the county, if it sees a problem with wildlife habitat, lobby that group for changes. That seems like that must be going on already. I wonder if that needs to be articulated, like Todd was suggesting, as a new item or added on to this one in this policy 12. The option would just be to keep the door open to advocate to that group on issues of water quality, wildlife habitat. If that's a standing committee that already exists with procedures for getting information in, which is what my guess is, that would go a long way.
Okay, so I don't know exactly where the policy is. I know we reviewed it several months ago at this point at our local CACs, but there is already language in the comprehensive plan that talks about using this committee that has been set up at the state level in order to discuss changes to the Forest Practices Act.
Yeah, Gail, is it your recollection that the language, we're getting bifurcated here, which frustrates me, and I think we should not go much further down this road before we vote on this particular line in the amendment, and then we can get to it in the second one. So I'm even going to stop my own comment and say let's worry about the third sentence and its impact on existing parts of the comp plan after we vote on the second sentence. I will say, only because I don't know that I've heard this particular sentiment, this sentence concerns me in that it makes our support and promotion conditional. And I don't know if that's, in my mind, I don't know if that's really a consistent and legal policy for us to say that we only support Forest Practices Act when it agrees with our estimation of whether something's effective or not. I think that's a dicey ground to stand on. So yeah, that's my feedback on this.
Let's vote.
Let me ask, is there objection to this language? Let's start with that. Is there any objection to the insertion of, to the extent such measures are ecologically effective methods? Any objection to that? Jim, is that objection?
Yes, it is.
Okay, we'll go to a roll call vote. Jim, you're the first voter on my screen. How do you vote on the amendment to insert to the extent such measures are ecologically effective methods?
I reject that. No.
Okay. Todd, how do you vote? Oh, I'm sorry, Todd, I didn't catch that.
No, I reject the idea of putting it in.
Okay, no. Jan, how do you vote? Didn't hear it.
No.
Okay, thank you. Susanna, how do you vote? I can't hear you, Susanna, sorry.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Pat, how do you vote?
As a procedural vote, no.
No, okay. Cheryl, how do you vote?
Yes.
Okay, by my count, we have two yeses and 4 noes, so the motion fails. So let's move on to the third sentence here, which is to insert after the end of the existing policy, the language, the county shall seek changes to the Forest Practices Act when necessary to better protect critical wildlife habitat sites. Is there discussion on this motion? I've got Pat and then Jim.
Shall advocate for, or again, some softer aspirational language would be fine with me.
Okay, is that a motion to change language or?
Discussion at this point.
Okay.
But I'll work in the chat box.
Jim?
I do not oppose, I actually support that third, that sentence, that county shall seek changes, but I would suggest that we have that as a separate policy if we don't already have one. Seems vaguely familiar that we've discussed this in the past, but in any event, have it as a separate policy.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Jan, was that a hand for discussion? No?
No.
Okay, back to you, Pat.
I guess I would like to know more underneath what Jim motivation for separating this out. I'm agnostic on whether it's together or whether it's a separate one. Just the addition to some aspirational language to complement the status quo assertion. I'd be open to guidance on at this point or later separate policy.
Jim, do you want to give feedback on that in chat? I do see your hand up.
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, it's mostly, I think, I believe policy should be clear cut and no pun intended, and just stick to one issue at a time in a policy. And you could have multiple policies or even sub policies tiered to the main policy. I think that we should include language in that last sentence to the proper procedures that already exist for making comments, either directly to the board or through the subcommittee, the regional subcommittee. That's really my motivation here, is just for at least my view of clearer policy construction.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Chad.
Yeah, I'm just unclear on the language when, who is to determine when it is necessary? What is the mechanism to trigger that? Who's responsible for monitoring that? I'm also concerned about better. Is that according to what science? And then to protect critical wildlife habitat sites, what's the determination of critical? So, I mean, almost every word here is not real clear policy, in my opinion. I just would like some clarification.
Okay, thanks for that. Gail, can I ask the question I was going to ask earlier, which is you were indicating that there is procedural language around seeking changes to the Forest Practices Act existing in the comprehensive plan. And have you found that? Is that what you're pulling over?
Yeah, so it's under the groundwater resources policies actually, but it's policy 3. It says when municipalities or water districts have identified possible conflicts between forest management practices and maintenance of the integrity of the watershed, the county encourages these entities to work with the Northwest Region Forest Practices Committee in the development of amendments to the Oregon Forest Practices Act that will provide needed modification and protection of state licensed water supply systems. So we have a policy and a procedure. In this case, it was specifically addressing groundwater resources, but that same language could be adapted for wildlife habitat resources as well. And I would also say that I have the same concerns to an extent that Chad has about who is making the determination that the changes would be needed about the wildlife protection habitat sites. Again, I don't know that this is something that staff currently has the expertise that we could address. In fact, I know we don't. So.
All right, thank you, Gail. I see a hand, Pat, maybe.
Remind me where we are in terms of the process, and remind me if where we are in our decision or our vote.
Sure. Process-wise, right now we're discussing the amendment to add the language in this third sentence here.
The third sentence only, kind of what I've been advocating for.
Correct. So we're just adding the third of the 3 amended language passages to policy 12. That's what we're discussing and what we'll have a vote on.
And so what my discussion, I will vote against this because for all the reasons that have just been said. The fact that Gail has reminded us that there is already a committee that is established to advocate for policy changes as that group is communicated to by residents of the county, that to me satisfies this last paragraph. I think, we can keep trying to change the Forest Practices Act without any leverage, power, or authority, but it's not going to happen. So I will ultimately be voting on keeping the language as we have adopted and not press forward on this any farther.
Okay. Is there other discussion from the group at this moment, Cheryl and Jim?
Procedure-wise, I agree that we should pull this out and consider it separately. So I'm in agreement that we should vote no on this third change. And then thank you, Gail, for going back and finding that, because I remember that discussion. And thank you for clarifying for us that that was dealing with Forest Practices Act in relation to groundwater resources. I think that we could use that language that we already previously hashed out and just have it apply to wildlife habitat resources. We're in goal 5, wildlife habitat resources right now, and we don't have any language for that.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. Jan's distracting us with the puppy. Is there any other discussion at this, Jim?
Yeah, actually, I was going to say something along the lines that Cheryl is just promoting. That's enough said. Just change the existing adopted motion to include wildlife habitat.
Okay. Any other discussion before we move to a vote here? Okay, so we'll go to a roll call vote since a couple of people have indicated maybe they're voting in the negative. So this vote is whether the amendment proposed is to add the county shall seek changes to the Forest Practices Act when necessary to better protect critical wildlife habitat sites to the existing language of policy 12. Jim Allegria, how do you vote on that addition?
No.
Todd Lundy, how do you vote on that addition?
No.
Jan Mitchell, how do you vote?
No.
Susanna Gladwin, how do you vote? I think that was a no. Okay, yeah. Pat Corcoran, how do you vote?
No.
Okay, Cheryl Johnson, how do you vote?
No.
Okay, by a vote of 0 to 6, that motion fails. We have an amended motion to consider, which is policy 12. We did add or change the language of shall rely upon to support and promote. So I'll reread quickly the language that I've got, which is Clatsop County shall, actually, I guess it's not shall that needs to be removed there. Did we make an error in removing shall? I don't think shall should be crossed out there. Clatsop County shall support and promote the Forest Practices Act and any supplemental agreements between the Fish and Wildlife Commission and the Board of Forestry to protect critical wildlife habitat sites. I'll read that one more time. Clatsop County shall support and promote the Forest Practices Act and any supplemental agreements between the Fish and Wildlife Commission and the Board of Forestry to protect critical wildlife habitat sites. Is there a motion from the floor as to what to do with policy 12? This would be an appropriate time to make other amendments or to accept the policy as amended. Todd?
I have a question. Is the word critical a word of authority, or is it? Yeah, art. Thank you. Does anyone?
Gail, do you know if that's?
I don't know. I can check though.
Okay, we'll hold for just a second on that question. Susanna, do you have other comment or question?
I think rather than the word shall, I would rather just go back to the original language under policy 12. The county shall rely on any supplemental agreements.
The
original language.
We already agreed on that amendment language, so unless there's a motion that's agreed to by like 2/3 of this group, we won't reopen that one again.
Okay.
We had a vote to amend that language and it passed. Pat,
Yes.
did you have comment?
Yes, and it's related to what you were just talking to Susanna about. I mean, in a different universe, Clatsop County shall support the FPA and encourage agreements between the Fish and Wildlife Commission and the Board of Forestry. Blah blah blah. So I'm okay with this passing. Support and promote seems a little overly enthusiastic. I think the county supports the Forest Practices Act. That's just sort of a statement, in fact. And I think any supplemental agreements would be to increase habitat for fish and wildlife. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Okay. Gail, do you have feedback on the use of critical wildlife?
Yeah, the only feedback I have is just doing a quick Google search. The only thing that comes up on Fish and Wildlife's website is the term crucial. Does not have critical. I mean, this wording has been in here for 40 years. You could either delete the word critical, replace it with crucial, leave it as it is. I mean, again, this is not something staff is going to be interpreting. It's going to be interpreted under activities covered by the Forest Practices Act, and that decision is going to be made at the state level disregarding or regardless of whatever our comp plan says. So if we want to put in the word purple wildlife habitat sites, it doesn't matter because it's still going to be whatever Forest Practices Act requires.
Okay, thank you, Gail. Is there a motion for how we should handle policy 12 at this moment?
I move we accept policy 12 as you have read it, as amended.
Okay, is there a second for accepting policy 12 as amended?
I second it.
Okay, thank you. Is there discussion for policy 12 as amended? Susanna?
I find the word support and especially promote the Forest Practices Act is unnecessary. As people say, we are required to. I like the word require, as we are required to. I find to support and especially promote to be problematic. That's all.
Okay, thank you, Susanna. Any other discussion?
I have a comment on that,
Um,
if I may.
Sure, Chris. And then I think Pat and then Gail.
I agree with Susanna. I don't understand why we should include wording that indicates our county is completely okay with the Forest Practices Act. I think we should leave room for the idea that we have a different view, and that instead of saying we support, we should just say admit that Clatsop County is required by the state of Oregon to follow the Forest Practices Act. But we would encourage, some more, just changes in policy, that we would encourage more protection of wildlife habitat. But in the opening line, I would say that our county is just simply required by the state of Oregon to follow the practices.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Pat, you had a comment?
So I'll just hit send again. I've got two versions of something that I think addresses what we've been talking about. So Clatsop County follows the Forest Practices Act and encourages supplemental agreements between Fish and Wildlife and the Board of Forestry to further protect wildlife habitat. I don't know, is it, people see chat?
Yeah, I can see it. So is that a motion to replace existing language with?
I'm afraid it would be. Yes, I'm afraid as we're talking through this, it would be a do-over from what we just agreed to. I'm afraid.
Is that to replace the entire policy 12? Is that correct?
Correct. And I'm open to some tweaking on this, but it was basically assert the FBA and encourage supplemental agreements to further protect wildlife habitat.
Okay.
aspirational but non qualitative.
Okay, so I'll take that as a motion to replace the language of policy 12 with the language provided in chat. Clatsop County shall support the Forest Practices Act and encourage supplemental agreements between the Fish and Wildlife Commission and the Board of Forestry to further protect wildlife habitat, period. Is there a second for?
I second.
Okay, Todd, thank you. Gail and Cheryl, I think you're in the queue. So Gail, do you have comment on this?
I just want to take a moment to remind everyone we have now spent probably over 45 minutes discussing 3 policies. We are not making very good progress. We do have a lot of items to cover on our agenda, and I think that we're spending a lot of time focusing on wordsmithing something that we cannot change. So I would encourage everyone to keep focused on what we can change, what we can't change, so that we can keep our meeting moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail. Cheryl?
I agree 100% with Gail, and what I was going to say is we have spent a long time on this one policy, and the change was brought from my group, but at this point I am ready to move on. Our group has a tendency to wordsmith things to death. And then part 2 is I like Pat's new clean language. I am willing to vote for that and move on. And I don't want to spend personally, I don't want to spend any more time parsing wording on this.
Cheryl, thank you. Commissioner Webb.
I'm sorry, I have been lurking in the shadows and just put my screen on. Why? I think that this group right now is dancing around an issue that's very important and that is not wordsmithing. The issue is, do we really want to put in our comp plan the words that we support the Forest Practices Act? Holy Toledo, guys, whoa. The Forest Practices Act can be changed at any time and is actually, tweaked, etc. And I certainly wouldn't want the county on record as supporting whatever anybody ever puts in the Forest Practices Act. I think that's a very bad policy move. And I think it would be much more important to say that we much more important to say the sort of the general not so much constraints, but the general characteristics of the Forest Practices Act, which respects the conservation of habitat, the preservation of groundwater. You might even add measures that preclude or that address wildfire issues, etc. There are, I think it's much wiser to say that we think the Forest Practices Act should address the following important issues, period. And that gives us and future folks who are working on the Forest Practices Act representing Clatsop County, then that gives them the incentive to make sure that these issues are addressed.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Chad, I'll recognize you in just a second. I want to at least clarify that that Gail has recorded the proposed language as Clatsop County follows the FPA and supplemental agreements between the Board of Forestry and Fish and Wildlife Commissions. There were a couple of versions in chat. One was support and one was follows. So the one that was recorded anyway was follows. So that would be the language we'll vote on here momentarily. Chad?
I just wanted to make sure I'm hearing this correctly. Commissioner Webb, are you saying that you do not think the county should support the Forest Practices Act as it evolves or as it currently is?
Yes, Chad, you are reading me correctly. I don't speak for the whole board here, but I certainly don't.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that
And
as commissioner, you think that the county should not support the Forest Practices Act.
Well, I don't think we should say that we don't. I think that we should say that we think that the Forest Practices Act should have the following characteristics. And, you know, and there are very few of our laws in Oregon that we are required to conform with. I mean, there are many, many laws that not everybody agrees to. But that doesn't mean that we don't work very hard, as some of us are doing right now in the present session, to change those. And so, yes, I don't know anybody who thinks that the Forest Practices Act is a good act other than the timber companies and the people who support them politically. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure that that was clear and on record. And I'd also like to mention that the Forest Practices Act, you know, there is the private forest accord and the MOU taking place right now. And I would hope that nothing is said or done to put that at risk.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with you.
Okay. Cheryl?
Under Robert's Rules of Order, is it possible to call for the question?
Yeah, you can.
I call for the question.
Okay. Question has been called. Is there a second? Todd's got a thumbs up, so I'll take that as a second. Okay, so we'll move to a vote. So this is, again, the motion is to replace the amended Policy 12 language with the language, and I'll read from the screen here. Clatsop County follows the Forest Practices Act and encourages supplemental agreements between the Board of Forestry and the Fish and Wildlife Commission. I think it was Fish and Wildlife Commission. Well, order doesn't matter, I guess. Yeah, Board of Forestry and the Fish and Wildlife Commission. Okay, I'll read that again because I've interrupted myself. Clatsop County follows the Forest Practices Act and encourages supplemental agreements between the Board of Forestry and the Fish and Wildlife Commission to further protect wildlife habitat was part of the motion as well. Thank you, Gail. Okay, so again, the motion is to replace Policy 12 as amended with the language that I just read. Jim Allegria, how do you vote on the motion to replace?
Yay.
Okay, Todd Lundy, how do you vote?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, there's I get a little delay on some of your audio. Okay, yes. Jan Mitchell, how do you vote?
Yes.
Susanna Gladwin, how do you vote?
Yes.
Pat Corcoran, how do you vote?
Yes.
Cheryl Johnson, how do you vote?
Yes.
Okay, by a vote of 6-0, the motion passes. And now we have new language for Policy 12. We need to have another motion to adopt that, to accept that language as amended. So could someone from the floor make a motion to accept Policy 12 as amended?
I move that the CAC approve policy 12 as amended.
Okay.
Second.
I second it.
I have a motion and a second to approve Policy 12 as amended. Is there discussion on this motion? Susanna.
Oh. I was just wanting to see the whole thing, and so on the far left is where you have the new wording?
Far right for me anyway.
In the chat?
I mean, far right. Okay.
Correct.
I can't on my screen see all the wording, I think.
Yeah, I can't either.
I see it now. Okay.
Okay, so I'll
Thank you.
read the language one more time so that we make sure that we are on the same page here. So the policy 12 as amended now reads, Clatsop County follows the Forest Practices Act and encourages supplemental agreements between the Board of Forestry and the Fish and Wildlife Commission to further protect wildlife habitat. There's a motion on the table to accept that amended language for policy 12. Is there further discussion on that motion? Okay, seeing and hearing no further discussion, let me ask, is there any objection to accepting the amended language for policy 12? Is there any objection for that amended language? Okay, hearing no objection, that language is accepted by unanimous consent for policy 12. Gail, can you clarify for me, underneath policy 12, there's some text in orange in our original document. Is that additional policy language or?
No, I don't know where it came from other than me making a mistake on the table. I apologize
Okay.
for that.
Nope, that's fair answer. So I think we're moving on to table 4 then, which is new policies worksheet for wildlife habitat resources. Is that correct, Gail?
That's correct.
And it looks like, in fact, we have that same language that was in orange on the previous page. I think it's the same language here that we have in purple. Are these suggested policies, and does someone care to own up to or speak to them? I know it's been a while since the other CACs have covered this material, but it appears to have come from someone in the countywide. Well, does anyone want to talk about these at all? So it looks like there's effectively 2 items here, right? Are these separate items? Would I read that correctly? That we'd have identify and inventory fish-bearing streams and other bodies of water, including connected marshes and wetlands, and add that to county web maps. And then a separate issue of add language to require the county to require resources mapped by the state and or federal agencies, similar to the wetland review process. Does anyone want to have discussion of either of these 2 items? Ashley, I see a hand up from you.
Yes, I just have a comment to make that Oregon Department of Forestry Stewardship Foresters, in conjunction with ODF and W fish biologists, we are constantly upgrading and our fish-bearing stream maps as we find streams and go out and work with landowners. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that maybe the county wants to put, like, are you annually going to update your maps, or every 5 years, or, you know, how often are you going to?
Okay, thanks, Ashley. Gail, did you have feedback you wanted to give on those items too?
No, I actually covered what I was going to say.
Okay. So if there's not feedback from the group, I think the default is that staff will work with and find appropriate language if they can to add these items in. Is that your understanding as well, Gail?
Yes.
Okay, and that maybe adding, as Ashley said, some time frames and things would be helpful to guide future staff. Okay, so I'm conscious that we're coming up to an end of a kind, an end of this section, and we've normally scheduled a lunch break at 12:30, which is 10 minutes away from now. I also I want to have just a moment here. This is not necessarily on our agenda, but I want to have a minute or two of discussion, if we can, about how we handle our time frames here. As Gail has mentioned, we're a pretty fair bit behind. We were hoping to have a sort of catch-up session yesterday that we didn't successfully have a quorum for, so that was unfortunate, and we've sort of not gained the 4 hours that we were hoping for there. So we're still effectively quite a bit behind. I think, as Gail said, we're maybe 4 sessions behind the local CACs. That's quite a bit, and I know that for the liaisons, that makes things very difficult because, as they've mentioned, they're having to mentally juggle several things because they're working far ahead. It also puts us in a challenging spot of whether or not we're going to get all of this done in the time frame allotted to us by the commissioners. So I want to invite discussion from the group for a few minutes here before we take lunch to see how we can confront that issue. I mean, there's meet more is an option. I mean, I see general options as we meet a lot more or we talk a lot less. And so how do we accomplish one of those things to make this work go faster so that we can get it done in the time we have provided for us? And by that, I mean in the couple of years we have left for this process. Can I get feedback from the group on that?
I think we all need to keep in mind the importance of limiting our comments to those which can actually be acted on, and trying to stay with Andy with his attempt to keep the meeting moving and addressing the issues he has before us instead of introducing additional issues and pushing us back in time frame. That's one. The other is, yes, we're going to have more meetings. And for the meetings, we need to be, for me anyway, we need to have some reminders, say in the day in advance. And then for me also, we were out of power for 3 days. And so I got behind in my emails and everything else.
Thanks, Todd. Pat?
I am unmuted. Good thing I didn't say anything. I really appreciate the job that Andy's doing. I think you're being very respectful of our struggling to get out messages and to keep on task, myself included. I would be fine to abrogate some of my individual time to have you ride rougher on the herd, if you know what I mean. If you could be firmer with me, I would be okay with that.
I will say in briefly addressing that anyway. So I read our bylaws yesterday again because I was trying to figure out our quorum rules, and it had been a long time since I had looked at them. I will say for the most part we've, I think, been following them, but one of the things that our bylaws instruct us to do is to try and reach consensus, and they do want us to discuss things. So I don't want to come across here as saying we shouldn't talk about things, or that I'm going to push you to be as efficient as possible, because they want us to come to consensus and actually meaningfully discuss things too. But you know, I think if efficiency is good, if we can find ways to get there.
Yeah, you won't hurt my feelings, especially on the procedural things. Like if I'm going on something that's qualitatively a tangent and we're in a vote or this. So yeah, it's hard for me to kind of keep track of everything laterally as you're doing such a good job on. So go ahead and keep me focused.
Okay, thanks, Pat. And Jim? And Jan, after Jim.
Well, I actually agree with what Todd's suggesting. It's probably the most realistic path that, you know, Andy, you do try to enforce the Roberts rules and try to keep us on track. And I do believe we don't have any alternative but to have some additional meetings, but we do need a commitment from the committee members that they will attend these additional meetings.
Yeah, thank you. Jan?
Yes, and I'm embarrassed. I completely blew it yesterday. So I would appreciate, as Todd has said, a reminder the day before, because sometimes the days, and obviously I have a distraction right now. But I'm willing to meet more frequently, and I'm willing to try to stay on task and not add extraneous opinions and tangents. I'll commit to that.
Thanks, Jan. Cheryl, I see you're live.
Yeah, I think both paths that you laid out for us, Andy, indeed, we do need to meet more often. And secondly, we need to be more efficient with our time. And I think sometimes we are so committed to doing this work and doing it to the best of our ability that we sort of overachieve. And I would just remind us again, and Gail has reminded us of this in the past, we are really the rough draft. After it comes out of us, it then goes to the Planning Commission, and they, I assume, will deal with not only issues, but will also wordsmith. And then it goes to the county commissioners, and I'm sure that they will deal with issues and may indeed wordsmith. So I think that we mustn't take our task of having each word so correct that, as we did, I think last month, we did 5 different amendments for 5 different word changes on one of our policies. So we're sort of big picture rough draft.
So one thing I might suggest on that particular point, I think, for example, today we had some problems with support and promote as language. You know, we spent a pretty fair amount of time on whether those are the correct 2 words or how we want to phrase that. I think when we come to those points, if we record a sentiment and sort of highlight a passage for staff, you know, I don't think it's a reasonable expectation for us to think that they're going to go back and wordsmith for us every piece that we've covered and approved. But if we say, you know, we think this piece of language is a little iffy, can you think about how we might improve it? I think that that's a reasonable tact for us to say, you know, our goal here is to say that that we know we've got to follow the Forest Practices Act, and we don't necessarily want to commit one way or another, because sometimes we might disagree with it, sometimes we'll fully agree with it. Can you come up with language that works for that? I think that's acceptable for us to do, in my mind. Gail, can I ask you a quick question before we take our lunch here?
Sure.
So I'm certainly hearing some sentiment from the group that we may want to do more meetings to make up some time here. Do you have suggestions for what might be workable? I have a feeling that since we're as far behind as we are, that setting up some interim regular meetings for a couple of months might be a good idea if we can work that in. Is that a possibility for you or your staff?
I think I would want to know how long of a meeting you're looking at. When we started this process, I deliberately set the countywide up with a 3-hour meeting once a month. All the other committees are 2 hours a month. Most of them complete their work in significantly less than 2 hours. And so you've gone from a 3-hour meeting now to a 7-hour meeting, now down to a 6-hour meeting with a supplementary 4-hour meeting that nobody showed up for. The length of your meetings, first of all, is too long. If you're going to do it, you need to go back to a 3-hour meeting. So that would be my first thought. If we need to do 1 or 2 supplemental meetings to catch this committee up, that's fine. But I'm sorry to sound moany about this and whiny, because this is my job, I understand that. But expanding your meetings from 3 hours to 6 or 7 hours has really impacted how my staff operates, because I'm taken out of commission for basically an entire day. They don't have access to me, so if they have issues that are piling up or questions that they need answered, I'm now putting their work behind as well. So we need to be more efficient in how we interact with each other. That would be my recommendation, and go back to 3-hour meetings. And like I said, if we need to schedule 1 or 2 to catch this committee up, then I'm fine with that. But I do not want to have 2 or 3 meetings a month on a regular basis.
Okay, fair enough as feedback. Susanna, and then I think we probably ought to take our lunch break. Susanna?
I would like to request for areas, Jewel got their electricity back pretty quick, but could we have a phone tree so that people are outreached other than by email? And I'm using my phone right now in this meeting, so there are alternatives than doing it on computers. And then just the last comment is before lunch. I'm totally lost at what we're going to look at this afternoon, and I want to just glance over quickly. So can we just, I'm looking at on my computer what was the PDFs that were sent, and I'm lost.
Gail, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so when we come back from lunch, we still need to finish the January 21st agenda. We still need to look at tables 5 and 6, and then you need to complete your agenda that's actually scheduled for today, February 18th, which is looking at wilderness areas, natural areas, and open spaces. With regard to establishing a phone tree and sending out reminders, I'm going to say this, and it's going to sound very snarky and snippy, and I will apologize in advance, but we are all adults here. I don't feel it's my job to babysit you and hold your hands and make sure that you show up for all your appointments on time. And that's just my 2 cents. And again, I apologize. I know that's not very professional, but I think we are all adults here. So
I totally agree, and I think I support you in that. I missed yesterday just due to my own not paying attention to it. So I think if we want to remind each other with phone tree, we can do that offline.
Okay, so let's take our half hour for lunch. I've got 12:33, so 30 minutes from now, we'll come back and I'll try to bring the meeting to order at 1:03.
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so we're picking back up. It's 1:04 p.m. Picking back up the second half of our meeting today for February 18th of the Countywide CAC. I do want to address, Cheryl had asked in comment if we would be reviewing Table 4's staff recommendations. I don't think for the most part we've been reviewing those staff recommendations, so unless there's direction from the group that you want to go back and review those, I think we're ready to go back or go on to Goal 5 resource topics, the next section. Is that?
No, thank you for clarifying that. I just didn't want us to drop any stitches that we had to come back and scoop up later. So if standard procedure is we haven't been reviewing those, then that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. Okay, so the next section, Gail, does that match with your needs as far as staff? Did you need feedback on any of those items?
not necessarily. A lot of what you'll see on there are things that we needed to do anyway under state statute to be consistent with the statewide planning goals. So there are things that we'll be doing anyway.
Okay, thank you. So the next section I've got starts on page 31, which is Goal 5 resource topics for federal wild and scenic rivers, state scenic waterways, Oregon recreation trails, and scenic views and sites. It looks like you've gone ahead to the Table 5 worksheet. Gail, do you need any feedback from us on the resource inventory, or do you want to just move on from that?
No, if there's, sorry, I didn't mean to cut that part out. If the committee had any comments that they wanted to make on that, that's.
Yeah,
Todd?
the the wildlife reserve on Highway 103, the elk feeding winter station, is not listed. Is there a reason for that? It is a state park.
Yeah, the wildlife meadows was actually covered earlier, and I forget which designation it had, but it's actually covered under another resource.
Okay.
Thank you, Gail. Any other questions, comments, deletions for the resource inventory page? And this, the resource inventory that I've got, actually, I may be looking at a completely separate one, Gail. I'm looking at the trails, waterways, views, and sites inventory. Am I not in the correct place?
No, you're in the correct place. I'm on the wrong agenda, sorry.
Okay, no problem. Just wanted to make sure we were on the same page, as it were. Yeah, thank you. So anything that we need to take off this list or add to it, folks? If not, no problem. We can move on. I just want to make sure that we address it. Susanna?
I never did get up to speed on all of this, but I think that the Lee Wooden Park, I know our group listed more, I believe, than here, and they are in our meetings. And is that adequate?
I'm not sure I have feedback for that, Gail. Do you know?
Yeah, so any recommendations that would have come out of the various committees either shows up here or on, which would be table 5 or would be on table 6. And I don't remember. Yeah, here, so it's on table 6. Susanna, add Fishhawk, Lee Wooden Park Falls to the inventory, add Jewel Meadows and Red Bluff Park and the Elsie Cemetery.
Gail, I just had a question, and this is referred to in text.
For adding Elsie Cemetery.
Sorry, Susanna, go ahead. Okay, Susanna, if you don't have more on that, then I have a brief question for Gail.
Oh, just are cemeteries listed in another place also,
Yes, they are.
Gail?
Yes, under historic resources.
Okay, because there's Jewel Cemetery too. But okay, thank you.
Gail, I note that it is in the text of the packet, page 2 of this section. You note the Nehalem River's a state scenic waterway, and it doesn't appear in the inventory for me. Is it? Should we add a state scenic waterway section to the inventory and include that?
Yeah, so it's not included in the current adopted inventory because it was added in 2019.
Okay.
But you'll see when we get to table 6, that's one of the staff recommended changes. Great. And again, it's something that we would need to do anyway. So. Okay,
great, thank you.
Yes.
Is there any other feedback for this section, folks? If not, we can move ahead to table 5 and review existing policies. So this is table 5, existing Clatsop County Comprehensive Plan policies on federal wild and scenic rivers, state scenic waterways, Oregon recreation trails, and scenic views and sites. In case you're curious, folks, why I read these out, it's just in case people are only on audio and can't see the video for what we've got up on our screen. So I'll read through the policies as we get to them. So policy 1 listed here for natural areas policies. Policy 1, significant natural and scenic, or excuse me, natural and scientific areas and scenic sites should be set aside for preservation and managed so as to protect the unique characteristics of the area. Staff recommendation is to retain the policy. 4 of the CACs agreed with staff recommendation. The LC Jewel made a recommendation to append with an emphasis on mitigating the effects of climate change to the end of the policy. Susanna, do you care to speak to the LC Jewel recommendation?
I think that, yes, there was, except for, I think, one abstention, we all agreed, the rest of us agreed to add that language, that the significant sites, in protecting them, that language should be added with an emphasis on mitigating the effects of climate change.
Okay. So I can take that as a motion coming out of committee. LC Jewel CAC recommends that we amend to add the language with an emphasis on mitigating the effects of climate change to the end of the existing policy 1. That doesn't need a second because it's coming out of a committee. Is there discussion from the rest of the group on that addition?
I'm wondering if our work on climate change would be kind of a category that would make that unnecessary, right? Kind of, again, kind of it's a category unto itself. We could either put it everywhere or be judicious in its use.
Jim? Oh, for some reason I don't hear you, Jim. No, still not getting it.
Jim, I think you might want to check your settings under camera and audio settings to ensure that your microphone is selected to the appropriate mic.
Jim, if you're able to come back, we could take a comment. Is there other comments from the are there other comments from the rest of the group? Jan.
I would think maybe it's Patrick's suggestion is a good one, that we when we actually are dealing with climate change, it would then be sort of a general background for all the policies.
Okay, thanks, Jan. Any other comments from the group on this one? Okay, Susanna, go ahead.
I think our group would be happy with that, as long as it's very clearly stated in the future.
Okay, thanks, Susanna. Let's try to go to a vote on this. Is there any objection to this inclusion? So this is to add the words with an emphasis on mitigating the effects of climate change to the end of the existing policy 1. Is there any objection to that? Okay, Todd, is that objection?
Yes, and I think
Okay.
we should put it off and deal with it under climate change.
Okay, we'll go to a roll call vote then. Your ordering has changed for me, so I apologize if you're used to the last one. But on the amendment is to add the words with an emphasis on mitigating the effects of climate change to the end of policy 1. Todd Lundy, how do you vote?
No.
Thank you. Susanna Gladwin, how do you vote?
No.
Okay. Jan Mitchell, how do you vote?
No.
Okay. Pat Corcoran, how do you vote?
No.
Jim Allegria, how do you vote? I see a thumbs down, so I will record that as a no. Cheryl Johnson, how do you vote?
No.
Okay, by a vote of 0 to 6, the motion fails. So we're back to the original policy of policy 1. Okay, is there a motion on the table to either amend or accept the language as it appears? Policy 1. Todd?
I move we accept.
Okay, is there a second for that motion?
Second.
Okay, thank you. Got a motion and a second to accept policy 1 as written. Is there discussion on that motion? Okay, seeing no discussion, I'll ask, is there any objection to accepting policy 1 as written? Seeing or hearing no objection, we'll accept staff recommendation to retain policy 1 as written. Thank you all. So on to policy 2. Policy 2, the county will cooperate with appropriate state and federal agencies and private groups to ensure that examples of the full range of Oregon's natural ecosystem are preserved for future study and enjoyment. Staff recommendation is to retain the policy. 4 out of 5 CACs have recommended supporting staff recommendation. Northeast CAC recommends strengthen language regarding proactive coordination with private property owners, encourage private property owners to enter into conservation easements, facilitate opportunities for property owners to voluntarily enter into conservation easements or other instruments. Cheryl, do you care to speak to the recommendation for Northeast CIC?
This was on the topics in December, and I missed that meeting. I was dealing with COVID that month. So I was not in attendance at this meeting, so perhaps Gail can help clarify, and if possibly those goals are covered in other places or other ways.
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, the conversation really was centered around a couple of particular places in the Northeast, one being Napa Gorge, and there was a lot of discussion about how the property owner that owned the property where Napa Gorge is had privately entered into a voluntary commitment to maintain it as a place where there would not be timber harvest. And I think Judd had spoken to this in detail. But I think the conversation was to encourage that to happen more often, just to encourage it to happen more often. So, and if Judd had anything he wanted to add.
Yeah, I apologize. I just got back from the dentist, so if I sound a little funny, that's what's going on. I seem to remember that there was some discussion around this was related to kind of the scenic areas provision in the comp plan, and they wanted to discuss how if properties change ownership, how certain areas could continue to be protected and that sort of thing. And so just kind of instruments of a voluntary private protection were discussed, and that conservation easements are obviously a tool that allow that. There's some challenges with them because of you have to find an organization willing to do ongoing management of that conservation easement. Yeah, if anyone's got questions, I'll try to recall it to the best of my ability.
Is this an item where Northeast CAC or Mr. Arnold, where since we don't have language in front of us, does someone have language to propose, or should we perhaps make a recommendation to staff that they mull over some language here? I see Susanna, you've got a hand, and then Chad, I see a hand up for you. Susanna? You're muted, Susanna.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm unmuted. I'm in the process of creating a conservation easement, and the county, in encouraging and facilitating opportunities, has lists of conservation groups that oversee the easements. I've been using a Portland group that they will donate for people that can't afford the yearly maintenance fees of the easement. They will donate their time sometimes.
Okay, thank you for the feedback. Chad?
Yeah, I would just like to know what's the intent of facilitate opportunities for private property owners to voluntarily enter the conservation easements. What is the cost of that facilitation and who's going to pay for that? Or is the facilitation just providing a list of a handful of conservation groups?
Valid question, certainly not spelled out here. Is there feedback from the group on language or a motion to go ahead with policy 2, either with an amendment or to go ahead as is?
I make a motion that we make this policy a separate one. It seems to be quite different. It has to do with private property.
To just to be clear, to add a new policy around encouraging private property owners and landowners to enter into conservation easements, that sort of thing, to add it to the new policy worksheet.
That's correct. Okay. And then we could have the staff word it.
Okay. So Todd has made a motion to add the sentiment from Northeast CAC to the new policies for this section. Is there a second for that?
Second.
Is there any objection to it being added to new policies? Susanna, is that an objection?
Yeah, I think it's appropriate here because it mentions private group under policy 2 private groups. And this is a private group. I don't think the word to facilitate is that difficult. The county has lists of conservation groups that help with the easements, and I think it's enough myself. I think the wording is adequate.
Okay, so since we have some objection noted, we can go to a vote on this one. So this vote is to add language around encouraging and facilitating private property owners to enter into conservation easements to the new policy section instead of being part of policy 2. Todd Lundy, how do you vote on that motion?
I vote yes.
Okay, Susanna Gladwin, how do you vote?
I'm so sorry, I got distracted. We're voting to put this language someplace else?
We're voting as to add it to the new policy section. It would be in the same section of the comprehensive plan. It would just be a separate policy standing unto itself.
I'm going to abstain. I think either way is fine.
Okay. Jan Mitchell, how do you vote?
Yes.
Pat Corcoran, how do you vote?
Yes, a separate policy.
Okay. Jim Allegria, how do you vote? Still didn't hear you on that one, Jim. Sorry. Oh, I heard that, I think. I got a thumb up and some static. So I'll take that as a yes. And Cheryl, how do you vote?
Yes.
Okay, so I've got by a vote of 4-0 with 1 abstention. I have that we will consider that as a new policy. So back to policy 2, the original language. The other CACs are recommending supporting staff recommendation. Can I get a motion to that effect, perhaps?
Moved.
Okay, Todd has motioned to support staff recommendation to retain the policy. Is there a second for that?
I second it.
Thanks, Jan. Is there any discussion of retaining the policy as written? I'm going to introduce a discussion point. I can't make motions, but I want to point out that it is my belief that Clatsop County does not contain the full range of Oregon's natural ecosystems. I think it is more appropriate for us to say the full range of Clatsop County's natural ecosystems. That's a personal thing. Someone else agreed with that and wanted to make that motion, great. If not, we can move on.
Yeah, I accept that as an amendment to my motion.
Okay, so we've got an amendment to replace the word Oregon with Clatsop County. Is there a discussion on that amendment? Is there any objection to that amendment? Okay, so without objection, that amendment passes, so we can replace Oregon with Clatsop County. So we're back to the main motion, which is to accept policy 2 now as amended. Is there any discussion, further discussion on policy 2? Okay, hearing no further discussion, is there any objection to accepting policy 2 as amended? Okay, I'm not hearing any objection, so by unanimous consent, we accept policy 2 as amended. So we'll go on to the next policy, which is under water resources policies. This is policy number 1. The county will cooperate and coordinate with state and federal agencies in assuring the maximum beneficial use of all water areas in the county. The staff recommendation is to retain the policy. All 5 CACs have moved to retain the policy. Let me look. We only have this page for this particular worksheet. So we don't necessarily need to do a bulk. Everybody agrees motion here, but is there a motion to accept policy 1 as written, retain it? Susanna, I see your hand. I don't hear you though. You appear to be muted.
Our group discussed the word beneficial. If the maximum beneficial use is a financial, if it can be equated with financial use, we were not in agreement with the word beneficial.
Gail, do you have feedback on how staff might read that?
Yeah, so the word beneficial would include the economic benefits of water as well.
Would it include other benefits?
Yes, it would include anything that would be beneficial.
Okay, thank you. Pat, I see a hand up.
Okay, so I think this came up somewhere else and I guess my real question is to Gail about, is this boilerplate that needs to be in there? But once you introduce maximum beneficial use, as times get dry, you just gave the cities all of the rural areas water. And so this maximum use of any particular thing is where we get in trouble. But if it's kind of like the Forest Practices Act that we're just kind of boilerplating to the next, then I'm fine with that. It seems like it's a legacy language, and if that's the case, it's okay. So I guess I wonder why it's there, and if it doesn't need to be there, if there's problems. I see you squirming, Gail. Am I off on a tangent?
No, not at all. And I didn't mean to squirm, but I've lost my train of thought. The county does not control water rights. So what will happen is either water rights are going to be approved through the Water Resources Department at the state level, or if there's a water district, then the water district will approve water usage. So the policy as it's written really doesn't have any teeth to it because we really don't have a role in it. It doesn't hurt if you leave it in. From my perspective, I don't think it hurts if you take it out. Either way. So, and the only reason beneficial use and economic impacts of beneficial use became an issue was because staff in a previous policy that was very similar to this, we had put in our staff comments thinking that someone at some point would ask, well, how is beneficial use defined? And we pulled the definition from DEQ, which includes economic benefit. So it's not a definition that the county uses or has in its codes, but that's the reason that economic benefit was even raised to begin with.
Got it. And my word is maximum. And so what it does do, though, is put the county on record as being an advocate for the maximum use of the resource. I'm willing to let this one go, but I think those are the words that we can, in aggregate, get us in trouble. It points to the fact that we identified that maximizing use to the highest economic bidder is what we support in the comp plan. But I'm willing to let that go. Andy, what should we do?
So I'm going to start. I've done this for expediency before, but I'm going to start taking the recommendations out of the CACs as a motion from the CAC, motion out of a subcommittee. So we've got a motion from Columbia Pacific, or excuse me, not Columbia Pacific, it is Clatsop Plains CAC to support staff recommendation and retain the policy. That's coming out of committee, so it doesn't need a second. Is there discussion on retaining this policy? Okay, so I'm seeing no discussion at the moment. Is there any objection to retaining this policy? That is policy 1 under water resources policies. Susanna, is that an objection?
Yes, an objection.
Okay, let's roll.
As I had stated early, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, okay, fair enough. So that was based on your earlier statement. So let's go to a vote then. We'll do roll call vote. Todd Lundy, how do you vote on retaining policy 1 under water resources policies?
Yes.
Okay, Susanna, how do you vote?
No.
Jan Mitchell, how do you vote?
Yes.
Pat Corcoran, how do you vote?
Nope.
That was a no?
That was a no. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Jim Allegria, how do you vote? No, I cannot hear you now. Sorry. I could read your lips, but okay, so I got a no. Cheryl Johnson, how do you vote?
No.
Okay, so we've got a vote of 2 votes to retain and 4 votes against. So the policy is not retained. Is there any action from the floor about what to do with this policy? Do we want to amend or delete? It would be your basic options now. Pat?
I move we remove the word maximum.
Okay, so I've got a motion to amend the policy by deleting the word maximum. Is there a second for that motion?
Second.
Okay, so I've got a motion and a second to delete the word maximum. Is there discussion of that? Susanna?
I don't think it reads quite right. I think just the first half, the county will cooperate and coordinate with state and federal agencies of the use of all water in the county.
Beneficial.
Okay, is there other discussion on the proposed amendment to
I guess
delete
it's
the
the
word
same.
maximum? I'm gonna take a scrivener's note because I think it should be the maximum, should be deleted just to make it read properly. Any other discussion? Okay, so let's go to a vote on that. I'll just do roll call vote right off. So this is a vote to amend by deleting the words "the maximum" from policy 1 under water resources policies. Todd Lundy, how do you vote?
Yes.
Susanna Gladwin, how do you vote?
No.
Okay, Jan Mitchell, how do you vote?
Yes.
Pat Corcoran, how do you vote?
Yes.
Okay, Jim Allegria, how do you vote? 2 thumbs up. Okay, that's a yes. Cheryl Johnson, how do you vote?
Yes.
Okay, so by a vote of 5 to 1, we will amend by deleting the words "the maximum." So now policy 1 under water resources policies reads, "The county will cooperate and coordinate with state and federal agencies in assuring beneficial use of all water areas in the county." Is there further action on this? We're back to actually the main motion. Or no, you voted down the main motion. So we're back to considering this. Is there a motion on the floor as to what to do with this policy 1?
I move we approve as amended.
Okay. Is there a second for that? Thank you, Cheryl. So Todd Lundy has moved that we approve policy 1 as amended. Is there discussion on policy 1 as amended? Okay, hearing no discussion, let's go to a vote. Is there any objection to policy 1 as amended? Any objection? Okay, so hearing none, by unanimous consent, policy 1 is approved as amended. Okay, so policy 1 under wilderness areas. Clatsop County shall work with federal agencies in the protection of federal wilderness areas. Staff recommendation is to retain the policy. All 5 CACs have recommended to retain the policy, so I'll bring forward from Northeast CAC a motion to support staff recommendation and retain the policy. So that motion is on the floor that we will retain policy 1 under wilderness areas. Is there discussion of that motion? Ashley, did you want to make public comment?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask the county if they have any federally designated wilderness in this county. I don't believe so.
No, we do not.
Thanks, Gail.
So
Was the notion to be proposed then? I mean.
So this is only operable in a future case in which we get a federal wilderness area. Is that a correct understanding?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
But we only have 40 acres of BLM in the county, and we have no U.S. Forest Service. And there was a little bit of federally owned land east of Emerald Heights, but I think that might have recently sold.
Okay,
that's all I'm aware of.
And actually, I do take it back. The Rocky Coastal Islands are federal wilderness areas.
Oh, thanks, Gail. I didn't realize that, but that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Is there discussion from the group on retention of this policy? Okay, let's go to a vote. Is there any objection to retaining policy 1 under wilderness areas as written? Clatsop County shall work with federal agencies in the protection of federal wilderness areas. Any objection to that? Okay, so I'm hearing no objection. So by unanimous consent, we can retain policy 1 under wilderness areas. Okay, so we are on to table 6. This is new issues and policies worksheet. I believe that the only new issue and policy that the countywide CAC has at this time is that the recommendation that we move down here on Todd's motion for the coordination, encouragement, and facilitation for private property owners and landowners to enter into conservation easements. Any feedback for staff or other additions that you all would like under new issues and policies? for this section. Todd? I think you came off mute, but then you went back on. So if you're talking, I don't hear you.
I'm not talking.
Okay.
Is that, read it again, or is that the county will cooperate with state and federal agencies? Is that it, or that's the old one we just did?
I think actually that portion in black can be taken off. If
Well,
my
I
memory
left it there to remind me why
Okay.
we're doing this.
That's fair enough. If it's helpful.
I'll just make a note that it does not apply.
Okay, thank you. If there's no other action or discussion on these points, then I think we're able to move ahead. Any other action or discussion on new policies for this section? Okay, I'm not hearing any. So if you're following along at home, this is the point where I believe we're moving to a new agenda altogether. Gail, I'm gonna do a little bit of procedural thing here, just in case. What I would like to do is ask for public comment and close the I guess is the January 21st meeting. So is there public comment on the areas that we just covered? If there's no public comment, then what I would like to do is close our continued meeting for January 21st, 2021. And then we'll immediately continue into our February 18 agenda. So hearing no public comment, I will adjourn the January 21 continued meeting and close that meeting off. I'm going to ask Gail to end the recording when she returns to her desk.
Andy, can you hear me now?
I can hear you, Jim. Did you call?
Well, yeah, I called in, so you can't use my mic on go to indicate whether I'm about to speak or not.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you, sir. Gail, if you have a second, we have adjourned the meeting for the January 21st continuation. Do you mind stopping and starting the recording or otherwise so that we can split and start the February 18 now?
Sure, one moment.
Thank you.
This conference will now be recorded.
All right, thank you for joining us. This is the Clatsop County Comprehensive Plan Update Countywide Citizen Advisory Committee meeting for February 18, 2021. We are getting started on our February 18 agenda after finishing up our January 21st continued agenda. My name is Andy Davis. I'm the chair. I'll call this meeting to order now at 1:45 p.m. With the permission of the group, I'd like to advance in our agenda to all the way to the 12 p.m. section, which is review, or actually we may even be past that now, are we not?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where we need to go to. Review of Goal 5 topic, wilderness areas, natural areas, and open spaces. Is there any objection from the group if we skip introductions, meeting summaries, CAC liaison reports, and move and public comment? Okay, I don't hear any objection, and just for what it's worth, I'm not trying to silence public comment. We take public comment on any individual item, and we'll continue to do that. So if you have comment as we're working through the material, don't think that we're trying to silence you here. So we'll move to review of Goal 5 topic, wilderness areas, natural areas, and open spaces. Gail, do you have any special instruction from staff on this section? Do we need to review inventory again? Is that correct?
Yeah, we should look at the inventory. Let me bring that up. And then in terms of what you're looking at, wilderness areas will be those federally designated areas that we just talked about on Table 5 previously. And then with the open space areas, those are areas that we defined in our comprehensive plan 40 years ago, and we broke it into 3 different types, which looked at general just vacant open space land, which included the forest lands, farmlands, the ocean and the beaches. And then there was a category that looked at parks, wildlife refuges, natural areas, scenic sites, which we've covered in previous resource discussions, and wetlands as well. And then there were other kind of developed open spaces, which would be things like golf courses and golf courses, period. And then finally, with the ecologically and scientifically significant sites, those were areas that were identified. If I remember correctly, I think they're on the Oregon Heritage Program, and they are listed there. And you'll see when we get to Table 2, there are a couple of updates to that as well, where we've added some additional items, I believe. Maybe not. Everything has blurred together at this point.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think it does. It lists Oregon, Islands, Wilderness, and any other new federally listed sites to be added to Goal 5 resources list.
Yeah. So
okay.
that's basically it.
Okay. Thank you. I'll kick it to the group then. Are there any items for the Goal 5 resource inventory for open spaces, ecologically and scientifically significant natural areas, or wilderness areas that the group thinks should either be taken off of the inventories or added to the inventories at this time? Todd?
Onion Peak was mentioned in your text as not having any natural designation, and yet it was also in the text identified as having scientific and natural importance. And I wondered if it wasn't premature to take it off the list, which is what I thought the staff had recommended by their notes. Gail?
Yeah. So that's not quite what we are looking for. So the existing policy 3 talks about a 1/4 acre site that was located on Onion Peak that in our comprehensive plan was given a land use designation of natural. And they wanted that 1/4 acre site to continue to be reserved for some sort of radio transmission facility that was envisioned to be placed there. And so what we put in our staff comment and recommendation is, first of all, we did not find any evidence of an existing radio transmission facility. We know that the comprehensive plan designation of Onion Peak is not the natural designation, which is separate from being a natural area in that it's not developed. So you have to distinguish between the two. And then we also confirmed that North Coast Land Conservancy has an easement in that area, and we contacted them and they agreed that there is no radio transmission facility there, and they also supported deleting the policy, which is basic. The policy basically addresses a 1/4 acre site for a radio transmission facility that does not exist and would not exist in the future given the conservation easement that's been placed on the land. Does that clarify and answer your question, Todd?
Where does it leave us then with the radio tower? Do we change that to delete the reference to a radio tower altogether? And then there's an LLC that owns part of that land, and how do they fit into this?
So we are recommending that the entire policy be deleted from the code. because there's not going to be a radio transmission tower there. And Onion Peak LLC, I don't know who is on the board of that LLC, if they have a board, but so I can't address the ownership issue of Onion Peak.
Gail, can I ask?
Eco Trust.
As far as the, thanks, Ashley just noted there's a radio repeater on Angora Peak. Can I ask Gail, for the resource inventory, does all of that background affect in any way whether we should list it as an ecologically and scientifically significant natural area in the resource inventory?
It is already listed.
Yeah, I'm just saying, is there any reason for us to take it off?
No.
Okay, so let's try and, I know we've got a wider issue with Onion Peak, but let's try and see if, are there any issues with the resource inventory that we need to cover before we move on to the policies? Jim.
It's more of a question. Do we know if there are any state designated areas that are particularly sensitive for, say, biodiversity? And is the county taking that into account in existing policies?
Okay, sorry, I'm trying to find here. We did have somewhere in one of our agendas at some point for some committee, this issue was addressed. I apologize for not being more on top of it here. Okay, so Saddle Mountain, Onion Peak are among the 8 sites in Oregon listed as dedicated natural heritage conservation areas. So you'd want to make sure that both Saddle Mountain and Onion Peak are included. So, and then this was the list. So you'll see Blind Slough Swamp was on there. And I believe that we have all of them on there. We didn't make any recommendations about adding new ones, but the ones that are on this list are already incorporated into our inventory. There's Saddle Mountain.
Thank you, Gail.
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions or comments on the resource inventory? Suzanne.
Oh no, I see Red Bluff Park. I was wondering about that.
Okay.
It's there.
Okay, if there's no other comments, let's move on to the policies section, existing policy section. That is table 1, existing Clatsop County Comprehensive Plan policies for wilderness areas, natural areas, and open spaces. So under natural areas policies, policy number 1 is significant natural and scientific areas and scenic sites should be set aside for preservation and managed so as to protect the unique characteristics of the area. The various CACs have reported supporting staff recommendation, which is to retain policy, but change scientific areas to areas for scientific research, and to add habitat preservation as a reason to set aside natural areas. So staff has recommended a couple of language amendments. The CACs have forwarded recommendations to support that staff recommendation. So we'll take from Southwest Coastal CAC a motion to support staff recommendation. That does not need a second since it's advancing from committee. So that staff recommendation is to change, retain the policy, but to change scientific areas to areas for scientific research, and to add habitat preservation as a reason to set aside natural areas. I assume that to be at the end of the language, but staff will work it out. Is there discussion on that motion to support staff recommendation? Okay, hearing no discussion, let's move directly to a vote. Is there any objection to supporting staff recommendation? That would be to retain policy 1, but to change scientific areas to areas for scientific research, and to add habitat preservation as a reason to set aside natural areas. Is there any objection to that? Okay, so I hear no objection. So by unanimous consent, staff recommendation for policy 1 is approved. On to policy 2. Policy 2, the county will cooperate with appropriate state and federal agencies and private groups to ensure that examples of the full range of Oregon's natural ecosystem are preserved for future study and enjoyment.
Yes, this is the same policy
Same
you
thing.
just addressed on your previous
Okay.
table.
The only thing that's different here is that Elsie Jewell seems to be recommending that we might need new policies in goal 7 around the inventory of radio towers in the county. Can that be addressed in new policy, Gail, if it's needed?
Yes, it can. Yeah, yes, it can. I mainly left it there just to remind everybody of it.
Okay, thank you. So we don't necessarily need a vote on this one because we've already voted on it. For policy 3, I'll read policy 3 off because this is a new one. A quarter-acre site located on the portion of Onion Peak designated natural shall be reserved for a potential radio transmission facility. The siting and placement of such a facility shall minimize impacts on the area's natural qualities. There's a long staff comment and recommendation. But the bottom line is that the staff recommends deleting the policy as it's perhaps no longer operable. All the CACs recommend supporting staff recommendation. So I'll take from Elsie Jewell, CAC, the motion from committee to support staff recommendation. So that motion is on the table. Is there discussion of supporting staff recommendation to delete this policy? Is there discussion on deleting policy 3? Okay, hearing no discussion on that, is there any objection to deleting policy 3? I don't think that was an objection. I think that was background noise. Any objection to deleting policy 3?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, so hearing no objection, we can remove policy 3. Jim, I see your comment in chat. Yeah, that it's actually the same policy that we covered in our previous session. So the note to change to Clatsop County should be retained. Is that correct, Gail? For policy 2.
Yes, and I made a note that
Okay.
said to see the previous table.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so on to policy 4. So policy 3 can be deleted. Policy 4, the natural designation for Sugarloaf Mountain shall not affect the continued operating and maintenance of the radio transmitter facility located there. Excuse me. Staff comment and recommendation is there is currently at least one radio transmitter located on private property on Sugarloaf Mountain. An expansion to that facility was approved in 2020. Site is an essential transmitting facility in the cellular wireless connectivity network for the county. They recommend retaining the policy and correcting the spelling error. All CACs support the staff recommendation. So from the Lewis and Clark group, I will forward Motion to support staff recommendation and retain the policy as written with a corrected spelling error. Is there any discussion of the retention of policy 4 with the spelling correction? Is there any objection to us retaining policy 4 with the correction? Okay, hearing no objection by unanimous consent, that policy or that staff recommendation is approved. So we will go on to wilderness area policy, policy 1, which is Clatsop County shall work with federal agencies in the protection of federal wilderness areas. Is this also one that we've recently covered, Gail?
Yes, it is.
So since we have recently covered it, can we just add a note to see previous action again? Thank you for that, Gail. And then the new issues and policies worksheet, this is a bit different format. I don't know if this necessitates action from us, Gail. Do you care to give guidance? Are these are all staff recommendations and comments. Do we need feedback on any of these?
If you want to, yeah, or you can just go straight into the new policies that you want to address.
Okay. Is there feedback from the group on, do we want to discuss any of these items? Susanna.
I'm for cluster development throughout the county. It's kind of a big issue. I would like to be sure that everybody else is on board. I am.
That is, I think, probably a rather big issue. Maybe we should have a bit of discussion for that. So just to clarify, so you're riffing off of the first staff comment there, which is the notation that Clatsop Plains has a clustering requirement, which is not a requirement of other planning areas, correct? And you're advancing the notion that perhaps it should be a requirement of all planning areas. Is that correct, Susanna?
Can I speak? I realize that I'm not sure that the word subdivision should be in there. I'm just thinking about my land of 5-acre adjacent lots. I'd like to be clustered, but it wouldn't be a subdivision, probably, I don't know. But I'm all for cluster development.
Okay, so
Gail, can you speak to the
the
term subdivisions?
Right. So in our codes right now, when you do a subdivision, which is basically you divide property into more than 3 parcels and up to 30 parcels in one fell swoop, that's considered a subdivision. And the reason that the clustering requirement is in there is that when people have done density transfers in the Clatsop Plains area and they've moved development units from a piece of property that gets downzoned and they move it over here to get extra units, we require those houses and those lots to be clustered together in order to provide 30% open space. And so that's what's driving the clustering issue. And it's actually a very common planning tool that's used across the country and around the world to help preserve open space. If you think of downtown Astoria, which is a classic grid system for the most part, and every lot is developed block to block and block to block, versus if you were to take that same number of houses, say there's 8 houses in a block, and you were to, kind of group them in such a manner, maybe, and the lots are usually smaller, but then you would also have a little bit more open space that would then become common open space area to be enjoyed by the people in that subdivision. So that's what's driving that. I know when Northeast discussed this issue last month that there wasn't a lot of support necessarily to have this apply everywhere. I think it was the Northeast, Cheryl, correct me if I'm wrong. But there really wasn't a lot of support about clustering subdivisions out in that area. And I forget the exact reason why.
Cheryl, do you have feedback on that?
Yeah, there was discussion. We asked the same question: what is a subdivision? What does a subdivision mean? What constitutes a subdivision? And we were remembering back to one of the earlier discussions, the need for affordable housing, and in the rural area, for us to be able to do duplexes and fourplexes, and for somebody to be able to divide their property into a little subdivision. We just didn't want this to clash with any efforts in the rural areas to be able to make affordable housing. So that was our thought there.
Okay. Is there other discussion on clustering at this moment? Are we wanting to pull this out into a separate item? Can we have maybe feedback from other CACs as to whether this is a good idea? Or Jan, you had your hand up.
Well, this goes into another arena, but I think probably it's at this point useful just to adopt it as for the Clatsop Plains areas, because that area has very specific soil and water issues, issues probably of liquefaction at some point, and probably so it makes sense in terms of their sewage or their septic systems, that kind of thing, to work with clustering. And all those things don't necessarily pertain to other parts of the county. So I would suggest it's a bigger issue to take on with cluster development throughout the area. The cities are already approaching it, and just leave it for the Clatsop Plains areas at this point, because I think it's going to be more varied. But it definitely is recommended for the Clatsop Plains area.
Okay, so at this point we've got at least two different notions. We've got some support for keeping it in Clatsop Plains. We've got some support for making it countywide. Susanna, before I go back to you, I see that Todd is on live mic. So Todd, do you have a comment?
Yes, we have one member of our committee that is adamant about insisting on cluster development anywhere that it can be applied to Arch Cape. And I'm not sure it can be, but nevertheless, she would be very disappointed if we didn't include it, if it was an option.
Okay, thank you, Todd. Susanna? And Jim, I'll recognize you after Susanna.
I realize, so I think cluster development is permitted throughout the county. I was confused over that, but is that right, Gail?
Yeah, so it's really highlighted in the Clatsop Plains, and it's called out as a specific type of development use, whereas in other zoning designations around the county, it is not.
Gail, was that the comment you had your hand up for as well?
No, my comment was I pulled up the other CAC tables, and Lewis and Clark also had concerns that it might not be appropriate for all areas of the county as well.
Okay, thanks, Gail. Jim?
Well, my question is based on a lack of knowledge. What is some of the opposition to extending this countywide? This is looking at the same issue, but from the flip side. Are there some significant issues that if we do go ahead with the staff recommendation, or are there really not any significant issues And just additional information would be helpful.
So I've got a queue lining up here. So Gail, if you want to address that, that's fine. I also see Chris came on live mic, Pam put her hand up, and Pat put his hand up. So Chris Farrar, did you have comment on this?
Yeah, more or less a question similar to what Jim was just talking about. I don't really understand what the disadvantage of encouraging or requiring cluster development, even in an area like the Northeast. I don't see that it limits the amount of housing that could be built. It just limits where you place them in a group, and then you leave a larger open space without a sprinkling of homes in it, but you get just as many homes. Am I incorrect on that?
No, you can basically get the same number of homes in there. I think what the concern might be is that in order to do that, you're creating smaller parcels or lots, and that definitely changes the character of the area where you're building. So if you think of five-acre lots, you've got 5 homes on 25 acres. Now your houses are spread out. You've got rooms for shops and accessory buildings, and it's kind of representative of a particular lifestyle that people are choosing to live by having small hobby farms like that. And then if you take that same number of houses, which would be 5 on 25 acres, but you cluster them together on 1-acre lots, it's a very different character and feel to the way the houses are laid out. And you know, there are definitely benefits to it because you're building less roads. If you had any type of utility out there, say you had water lines, you have less distance to run water lines, which means that the district has less water lines to maintain, which helps their operating budget. And you have a little bit more efficiencies in, but it is definitely a different character than what you would normally associate with 25 acres and 5 houses.
Thanks, Gail. Commissioner Webb, and then Pat.
Harking back a couple of years to the housing study that was done, both Gail and I expressed disappointment that study didn't address issues of rural development to the extent that we were hoping it would. And in fact, in my experience as a planner, I've worked in a couple of counties that were fast growing, and there's always the potential problem of creating an area where the people who live in a cluster kind of development then begin to expect municipal services, more urban related services. They want the street plowed. They want, and of course, for us here, it poses some serious environmental issues, especially about water and solid waste disposal. So it's something I wish there were a way we could study this. I really do. I mean, I can't commit any of the county's money, but boy, I'd love to have, a good consultant come in and say, hey, what's going on in similar geographic places? And give us some creative ideas. I've used, in one county I worked in Virginia, we created a hamlet. I guess what we here would call a template, that actually allowed for more than 5 houses, but created serious constraints about utilities and things like that. And I just feel that maybe we can get creative here. I seem to be one of the few people who thinks that Clatsop County is going to grow, and we are growing fastest in our rural areas. I don't know. I'd almost like to kind of put a halt to this discussion with a plea to, hey, let's get smart about this. You know, let's do some creative planning here. That's my 2 cents.
Okay, Pat, and then Cheryl, I see your hand.
I think Pam and Gil really made the points that I wanted to, and that is, and to answer Jim's question is what would be wrong with doing this? I think a short answer is cultural, like Gail said, and I can see someone saying, I didn't move out to LC Jewel to live in a mill pond environment. And so I think the research needs to look at, I bet there are culturally similar people who would be okay with a cluster development out in the rural areas, but I think 80% of people who moved to rural areas did so to get away from things like cluster developments. I'm done.
Thanks, Pat. Cheryl?
I was going to say that even though Northeast did have some questions about meanings of subdivisions and some concerns, as a group, we okayed the staff recommendation, and I'm ready to vote on this one.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. So we don't necessarily have something to vote on yet. No one's made a motion. We've just been having sort of discussion about cluster development. Of course, someone can make a motion and we can vote on something, but right now we've just been giving Gail things to think about. Susanna.
I move that we wait and have this discussion under goal 4, is it population?
We have 2 goals that it would be appropriate for: goal 10, which is housing, and goal 14, which is urbanization.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to pick one of those 2 for your motion, Susanna?
Housing, not urbanization, but housing.
Okay. So I've got a motion
that we move the discussion.
Sure. So I've got a motion
to move the discussion when we take up housing.
Got a motion
Second.
To discuss clustering as new policy during our housing goal discussion. And we've got a second for that. Any discussion about moving clustering to the housing section for discussion? Okay, is there any objection to us picking that discussion up during our housing goal? Okay, no objection. One last time. So I'm seeing and hearing no objection to that, so we can discuss that more robustly when we get to housing. Do we want to have discussion today over any of these other items for staff recommendation? Open space acquisition, verification of the sites in the Oregon Islands Wilderness area. I think that's straightforward. Or register, Oregon State Register and Natural Heritage Resources considerations. Do we want to have discussion on any of those items, Cheryl?
I can tell you that Northeast got to look at and talk about each of those 3, and we are in support of staff recommendation for all 3 of those.
Okay. Is there any objection from the group about any of these staff recommendations? I think that might be the easiest and quickest way to do this. Any problems with these recommendations? If not, then I think we're good on those. Gail, I hesitate to even ask this question, but is that the end of our material?
It is.
How did we manage that?
Oh my God.
We go too fast.
Yeah, we need to slow down a little bit.
because we're awesome. That's why.
So we haven't had any other materials as a countywide CAC to review at this point. Is that correct? Are there any administrative tasks or anything that we should cover today, Gail?
Yeah, probably just a couple of administrative things. So next month, which will be your regular meeting on March 18th, first of all, do we want to keep it at 11 but keep it to 3 hours, or do we want to go back to 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock and keep it at 3 hours?
11.
Well, I'd go for 1.
Yeah, I would too. Not
Me
to break
too,
up
because
the meeting in the lunch hour.
then you don't have a break for anything.
Cool.
Okay, so it sounds like we've convinced the holdout for 11 to move to 1. So let's try scheduling at 1 again.
Okay, so we'll do that. Next month then at 1 p.m. we will be covering the last resource inventory of goal 5, which is energy sources, and then we're also going to review goal 13, which is energy conservation.
Okay.
So we'll finish up those 2 goals and move on from there. I think that's all the administrative items I have. Oh, one other thing. Crest we had contracted with Crest to update the Duncan Thomas report and identify wetland areas, and to also develop some criteria and a definition for riparian corridors. They are expecting to be completed with that work at the end of March, and then we'll be working with them to hold a workshop to talk about the findings, for lack of a better word, that they've developed sometime probably in mid to early mid-April. So.
Cool, thank you. Gail, could I ask a favor? And maybe this has come up before and I just wasn't fully aware of it, but obviously today we had a couple of items that we ended up covering in both policy worksheets because we were doing a couple of different sections, right? Maybe I'm wrong about this, but will there be other items in the future where that's likely to happen, where we'll see a policy that we've already weighed in on at some previous point?
Yeah, we'll try to keep those to a minimum. We have different staff members who work on different inventories and different goals throughout this process, and sometimes we get a little over exuberant, and I may read a policy one way and think see how it can apply to a certain area when it might be more appropriate in just the place where I originally found it. So we'll try to keep those to a minimum.
Well, and I'll say I don't think it was bad or unnecessary that they were in both places. I think it's just that today we had the advantage that we, like for the example that Jim put in chat, that we had already weighed in on changing wording for a particular policy, and we just literally looked at it like a couple hours ago. So we remembered that, oh, we can just skip this. But we might want to consider it in a different perspective because we're looking at a different goal, right? So I guess I'm just asking for really notation that we may have covered it before. Obviously today that wasn't possible for you either because we had just literally covered it in the morning and then we looked at it again in the afternoon. So you couldn't have put in what we had put in, what we had amended, but if those sort of situations come up, it'd be awesome if we could get what our previous action was.
I can do that.
Any other administrative items from the group or public comment at this time? Susanna?
I agree Gail should not be calling all of us, but I was thinking of calling people yesterday and didn't. It's difficult when certain areas of the county get hit with natural disasters or whatever, and we lose our power, especially is the most vulnerable probably. And I would love to know if we can have a place we have contacts for each other. Is that okay?
Let me ask of the group here, is there any objection with, I don't want Gail to be having to track us down, but is there any objection from the group with, Gail, do you have our phone numbers that you could share a list of our phone numbers just so we could call each other if something comes up like that?
Yeah, if everybody is in agreement with that, I'm happy to send that out.
Is there any objection from the group in Gail sharing a phone list for us? I will say I quickly texted the people that I had numbers for yesterday, but I don't have numbers for everyone, so it would have been useful in that instance where we didn't have a quorum. But if you're uncomfortable with it, I don't want to do that at all if people are reluctant.
I'm okay with that.
Okay, and I at least will promise not to abuse that at all. I hate texting or the phone anyway, so it shouldn't be a problem. Okay, thank you, Gail, if you can do that. Any other, Todd? Yep.
How will we set up these makeup meetings?
At this point, you don't need one, and I'm hoping that with 3 hours, you can keep on your agendas and complete them at your regularly scheduled meeting.
Okay, and then I have an observation. In going through this process, it seems that a lot of the new policies we're coming up with are very timely. And I wonder if these policies wouldn't be necessary, if we wouldn't need to amend policies more frequently than every 10 years. How does that work?
I can only speak from my perspective. The way that I would do it, I came from Florida, and by state statute, you are required every 7 years to update your comp plan. I personally would do it in 5 years, where you are just basically going through this process that we're doing now, but hopefully it goes much quicker because you've only let 5 years elapse, and it's easier to just pull all those policies and say this one's completed, this one's done. It's less research because hopefully 40 years hasn't elapsed and staff doesn't have to go back and try and figure out the intent of a policy that was drafted more than 40 years ago. So ideally, we should be opening it up and looking at it every 5 years and keeping it up to date.
What is the process by which somebody can change it, say a year from now after, or when we're done with our work a year later, and say, look, we need to have a policy which does something that accommodates this new situation?
Okay. So there are a couple of different ways. One is that anyone can pay the application fee and submit an application to amend the comprehensive plan. So it's a $5,000 application fee for a map amendment, $5,000 for a text amendment. Alternatively, if we identify either through the Board of Commissioners, staff, the Planning Commission working together, an issue that needs to be addressed, then administratively, and I'm probably using the wrong term in terms of land use planning here, but we go in as staff and initiate that amendment process. And then it goes through the normal procedure of going to the Planning Commission, the Board of Commissioners, and ultimately Department of Land Conservation for review.
Thank you.
Okay, any other items from the group, or I'll ask again, is there any public comment at this time?
Yeah, Patrick did have a question in the chat about could this committee recommend that the plan be updated every 5 years or reviewed every 5 years? And certainly.
Thanks, Gail, for bringing that up. Okay, well, if I'm not seeing any other comments at this time, I believe we've gotten through our business agenda for today's meeting. So if there's no objection, we can be adjourned. Thank you all for your time today.
Thank you, Andy and all, and Gail.